The wicked take the truth to be hard. And who are the wicked? They are those who deceive themselves. A fight, a real fight, brings out the truth. I've said many times before that martial arts is the pursuit of the truth. In its most basic form, that means that either our technique works or it doesn't. We learn the truth about our training right away. We can dig deeper than that if we want to. Let's focus on that for a minute. There was a fight between Bruce Lee and a man called Wong Jack Man. And many stories have been told about this fight. In fact, they just made a movie about it. A very romanticized movie where the fight is portrayed as this Hong Kong-style kung fu movie with wire work and crazy stuff going on. Now, according to the different accounts, the fight happened differently. I think probably the most reliable account was from Linda Lee Caldwell, because what she described sounded like a real fight. What many of the other sources described sounded like fantasy. What Linda Lee Caldwell, Bruce Lee's wife, said about the event was that there was a lot of running around. They grabbed each other, they tumbled on the ground, there was some hitting. Bruce got on top, hit Wong Jack Man a few times and said, "Do you give up?" in Cantonese, and Wong Jack Man gave up. The fight was maybe a couple minutes long. And afterwards, Bruce Lee was very disappointed in himself. See, this was before he began his philosophy of Jeet Kune Do. He was, at the time, a Wing Chun practitioner teaching Wing Chun, which is why he had supposedly been challenged by some of the people in the Chinese martial arts community who felt that it was bad and wrong of him to teach Americans, to teach non-Chinese this Chinese martial art. And so they sent Wong Jack Man to fight him to prove a point of some kind, supposedly. Now, when I heard Linda Lee Caldwell's account, I realized that sounds like the most authentic version I've heard, because if you ask Wong Jack Man, the fight was like 20 minutes long and there was all kinds of back and forth, and he looked awesome, and more along the lines of what we see in that recent movie than what would have ever happened in a real fight. Now, I posit that was Bruce Lee's first real fight. And some of you are probably thinking, no, Bruce had all these rooftop secret underground fights back in Hong Kong, and that's why they sent him to America, or he did an amateur boxing thing in Hong Kong at some point. And all of that may or may not be true. Let's work under the assumption that it is. Let's say Bruce Lee had all these street fights before coming to America, before having this match with Wong Jack Man. Let's work under the assumption that yes, absolutely, he did have these street fights. And I will still tell you that fight with Wong Jack Man was his first fight. And it changed him because it exposed him to the truth about his martial art. If he had had a real fight before then, he would have had that epiphany before then. Now, street fights, I've said many times, and I will say it again, are not real fights because there are not real fighters involved. I had a student many years ago who was a fantastic athlete, and before he started training in martial arts, he got into a lot of street fights, drunken brawls, bar brawls, that sort of thing. And People tend to look at those things through rose-colored glasses. He remembered them gloriously. His buddy remembered him being this badass who just could beat the pants off anyone. But there's a world of difference between fighting somebody who is not a fighter, especially when you're drunk, and fighting somebody who is a fighter, somebody who's a trained killer, when you are sober and you have your wits about you and you understand the dangers present in front of you. And you've had time to think it through. And when we have time to think through a fight, we understand our very nature does not want us to be in one. So Bruce Lee's first real fight, in my opinion, was that one with Wong Jack Man. And he got tired. He was very disappointed in himself because his technique failed him. There's a video, I don't remember the names, but you can see it on YouTube. 2 Wing Chun masters. It's an older one. These 2 Wing Chun masters, they met and they had a duel. They had a sparring contest between the 2 of them. And I suppose everybody expected to see all of these classical Wing Chun forms and movements, and it was going to look awesome, but it didn't. Instead, after throwing a few punches, they latched onto each other like a couple of school children, started clinching and hugging and tumbled on the ground and throwing some sloppy hammer fists. It turned into an animal brawl very quickly. And I think that's another example of, while they were masters of their style, that was their first real fight. Our first real fight is going to suck. Our first 10 fights are going to suck. I have a friend, a guy named Brian, and he is a Wing Chun master. He's probably the best Wing Chun practitioner that I know as far as using his martial art for practical fighting. Even so, about 8 years ago, he decided to put his martial art to the test in an MMA fight, an amateur MMA fight. And he was fighting a guy with some judo and jiu-jitsu and boxing experience. And Brian did win the fight after 3 rounds of fighting. But he did not do it with Wing Chun. He started out in his classical stance and he had his hands at the ready and he started out trying to win this fight. He wanted to prove a point. He wanted to prove that his martial art he had invested so much time, a lifetime, into mastering, worked in this arena of combat. And so for the first round, he went out there and he tried his classical Wing Chun forms. And they did not work. His opponent kept moving around him, kept hitting him in the face, landing some leg kicks, working outside of the syllabus of Wing Chun. And it was frustrating, and I saw the frustration on Brian's face. You could see this grand, beautiful delusion breaking apart and the truth being exposed. Now, Brian is a fantastic athlete, very strong guy, very fit. And I think that's a big part of the reason why I say that out of all the Wing Chun practitioners I know, he's probably the best. Because most people who practice these classical styles of traditional martial arts are terrible athletes. And in order to be a good fighter, we must be a good athlete. There is no way around that. It's not magic. So after about a round of trying his Wing Chun technique, I could see he was very frustrated. And Brian did have a background in Muay Thai. Not an extensive one, but he did have a background in Muay Thai, so he was not unfamiliar with punching and kicking for range. And he had a background in German Jiu-Jitsu, so he was not ignorant of grappling concepts. And so after the first round, he threw that Wing Chun style, he threw the forms out entirely and started, doing some Muay Thai. And he clinched up and he grappled. And by the third round, he ended up on top on the ground and locked up an arm lock. And he won the fight. But afterwards, what happened to him was basically the same thing that happened to Bruce Lee after his fight with Wong Jack Man. The truth was exposed. This idea that he had that I'm going to be the Wing Chun guy in MMA, I'm going to use this classical style to win this fight and prove to everybody that it works. And that wasn't the case. Instead, what worked was adapting to the situation and being flexible with his style and drawing on previous experience with other martial arts, essentially mixing his martial arts, How about that? Mixing your martial arts works to win MMA or mixed martial arts fights. Crazy idea, huh? So he had the same epiphany Bruce Lee had, almost literally, that Wing Chun itself is not the answer. You must adapt. And I talked to some of Brian's students after this, and they mentioned that he changed his style of teaching. He changed his approach. It was no longer the exact, everything has to be this way like the textbook says sort of methodology. It was, let's adapt this so that we can win if the other guy does this thing that isn't in the syllabus of movement. And that's fantastic. And essentially that was Bruce Lee's approach to developing Jeet Kune Do. Let's throw out what does not work and bring in what does, and be flexible and be like water and flow and crash when necessary, instead of when the crystallized method tells us to. Because crystallization is order and fighting is chaos. That's the truth of a fight, that it's chaotic. So how do we thrive in the midst of chaos? Very simple. We tell the truth. And what does a martial artist do? We tell the truth with our body. We tell the truth with our actions. I myself had a very similar experience with Taekwondo. It was my first martial art that I practiced. And I loved it. And I had a talent for it. I had a proclivity for it. And when I started competing professionally in combat sports, I felt like it was my mission to be the Taekwondo guy in kickboxing, and then the Taekwondo guy in Muay Thai, and then the Taekwondo guy in MMA. And I felt like I wanted to prove to the world that Taekwondo works in a cage fight. And the truth is, everything can work in a cage fight, but we must first be a cage fighter. And a Taekwondo player is not a cage fighter. All of those techniques, every last Taekwondo technique is a viable fighting technique that can work in a cage fight if we understand the rules of engagement in a cage fight. If we know how to wrestle, if we know how to box, if we understand jiu-jitsu, if we understand the basic concepts of movement for the sport of mixed martial arts, we can add anything on top of that. Take a random obscure martial art that people laugh at, and if you are good at wrestling and good at boxing and good at jiu-jitsu, you got a functional understanding of Muay Thai, kickboxing, you can add that crazy stuff on top of it. And right now is a very fascinating era in the sport of mixed martial arts because we're starting to see that. We're seeing guys who know how to wrestle and they know how to box and they understand the concepts of Muay Thai and clinch fighting and all that good stuff. And they know something else. They know karate or taekwondo or some fancy cool looking kick they're able to incorporate into their game that they otherwise would not be able to. But when I started out, I didn't understand that because I had never seen that before. Nobody had ever seen that before. What did we see? We saw the early UFC where the karate guys and the taekwondo guys and the kung fu guys got smashed because they didn't know how to grapple. And when I first saw the early UFCs, I was both very intrigued because I knew it was the truth, it was a real fight. It was what really happens when somebody who doesn't know how to grapple fights somebody who does. But at the same time, it made me angry. Remember what I said, the wicked take the truth to be hard, and who are the wicked? They are those who reject the truth. And at the time, I rejected the truth. I had invested so much of my life into this style of standing up and kicking and doing the fancy, cool-looking Hollywood kicks that I didn't like the idea that I would have to spend at least that much time mastering all these new skill sets. That made me uncomfortable. That made a lot of people uncomfortable in the traditional martial arts world. And it still does to this day to a lot of people who make a living off of that. You might have seen this fight floating around the internet. It was a fight that happened here in Shanghai, not too far away from this gym where I am right now, between this MMA fighter and a Tai Chi practitioner. And the Tai Chi guy goes out there and he gets punched in the face a dozen times and just pounded into the floor, and it's over very quickly in about half a minute. And the MMA fighter Xu Xiaodong, he's from Beijing, but he came down here to Shanghai, and he issued this challenge to these traditional martial artists, these traditional masters. And when he says masters, he's talking about the frauds, right? Now, I have met a legitimate master of Tai Chi. The guy's 80 years old. And he taught me something very important, that to master a style, we must commit our lives to it, our whole life. And I have met thousands of people who claim to be experts in various styles of kung fu, tai chi, etc., who could not fight their way out of a wet paper bag. And it's that latter group that I believe Xu Xiaodong was criticizing with this fight. And a lot of people on the internet are very excited about this, like, oh, look, man, martial arts isn't real. Deceiving ourselves is not real. Spending a lifetime waving your arms in the air without any practical application of combat is a lie. And so, when we get into a real fight, when we face the truth of what happens when somebody is aggressively punching at you, clearly, if we have not trained for that specific situation, we are going to get punched into the face, into a bloody pulp on the ground. So, I think we all need to have that epiphany moment, whether it is in martial arts or in some other aspect of life, preferably over and over and over and over again, until we chisel off all of these pieces of ourselves, or what we believe to be ourselves, that are not actually the truth. Until all that is left is the truth. Because that is how we function in the midst of chaos. That is how we triumph in the midst of chaos, by telling the truth.